Hello, welcome to History 203, which is Cleveland history with focus on Lakeview Cemetery and its contributions to Cleveland. I would like to say that this is going to be our first uh, video presentation lecture, which each lecture is accessible through YouTube, but this is going to be our first lecture. And it's going to cover our introduction to Lakeview Cemetery before we deal with the major context of how we examine Cleveland's history through Lakeview Cemetery. So, what we're going to do, we're going to title this first lecture Lakeview Cemetery, Cleveland's History Buried Here. And I'm about to begin the lecture. Lakeview Cemetery, when considered, can be one of the most beautiful places in Cleveland, Ohio. If you haven't been, I recommend for the purposes of this course that you go. During the time period which we're going to be dealing with for this course of 1860 to 1920, this cemetery contributed to being one of the reasons why individuals would come to Cleveland, Ohio. It's almost ironic because during our period in time, many Americans don't see that much of a reason to come to Cleveland, aside from visiting a Cavs game now, an occasional Browns game or sports or event. But during this time of 1860 to 1920, Cleveland was actually the place to be. It was a place even presidents wanted to live and die here. So it's going to be very important for our purposes. Now, Lakeview Cemetery shows Cleveland's once upon a time prominence in economy and industry. So it is the place that holds Cleveland's as well as the world's wealthy elite, all within this cemetery. So it's a very important place to kind of check out if you've lived in Cleveland or haven't lived in Cleveland and haven't been. And much of the history of Cleveland is here in this cemetery if we just take a further examination. So thusly, we've titled the paper or this section of the lecture, Lakeview Cemetery, Cleveland's History Buried Here. So, as I stated before, we're going to examine Lakeview Cemetery related to Cleveland's history in a few major contexts. And these will help give us better insight into Lakeview Cemetery during this period of 1860 to 1920. The first context, and one of the most important that we'll go through at some point in the modules, is a historical context to explore and examine the significance of Lakeview Cemetery on Cleveland, kind of from a historical standpoint during this time period. Again, I keep repeating it, but it's between 1860 and 1920. Next, which we're probably going to start off with first in this class, is the labor and economic perspective of how it helped develop Cleveland and even the surrounding suburbs. Then we're going to examine how Lakeview shaped certain class and race dynamics in Cleveland, as far as just from sectioning different areas of the city. And then lastly, we're going to look at Lakeview in the context of local Cleveland history and within a national context to see kind of how we measure up against other places around the United States. Lakeview Cemetery, we're going to actually go to our next slide. Okay, we're going to begin our first lecture here from Module 1. Now, I do want to say ahead of time, all the information. There'll be a lot of information that's tossed out, um, that goes beyond the span of just the bullet points. So it is important that you do try to take notes uh, on some of the specific things that I point out. But also, I'll leave some type of bibliography for each of the modules, where some of that supplemental information is coming from. And this is in addition to the supplemental readings that you will have for each of the modules. And you're going to need those supplemental readings to answer some of the discussion board assignments, as well as some of the written reflection questions. So that's just important to keep note of those things. But we're going to begin our lecture. Now, Lakeview Cemetery was founded about 1869. It spans about across 285 acres of land bordering East Cleveland as well as Cleveland Heights. So one of the most important features of the cemetery is its view of Lake Erie to the north. So thus it's called Lakeview Cemetery. Pretty self-explanatory. This cemetery was created with the basic outline of other rural cemeteries or garden cemeteries during the rural cemetery movement. One of the main points of this rural cemetery layout was the Victorian style and of art and sculpture, and that's something that we'll really get into specifically towards Module 3, but a little bit in Module 2 as well. So these are important things to note, but this is just to get a basic introduction into things. Also, a main theme of these cemeteries were to be an arboretum. Okay, we're going to begin Module 1, which is just going to give us a basic introduction and overview to Lakeview Cemetery in general, and kind of a little bit of how it contributes to Cleveland's history, some of the economic development, as well as some other things. Now, it's going to be very important within these lectures. There's going to be a lot more than just the bullet points covered. So it's going to be very important that you first listen to each of these modules, watch the videos. In addition to that, it's going to be very important that you take notes as well, especially for the sake of the discussion assignments and the written reflection assignments as well. Each of those they're going to have a lot of material, a lot of things from the supplemental material. So it's going to be very important that you watch these lectures, take notes on them, get the information that you need. Also, additional to that, follow along with the supplemental materials and readings that are posted with each module, so that you'll be able to kind of develop your own perspective in developing that final paper, which is going to be very important, especially to your grade. And lastly, in each module, what I'm going to do, since I'm tossing out a lot of information, in particular that you may not have, I'm going to some form of bibliography or citation of sources, so that you'll be able to have access to these supplemental materials that are used in the development of these lectures. So with that being said, let's start. Okay, Lakeview Cemetery was founded in 1869. It spans across about 285 acres of land bordering East Cleveland as well as Cleveland Heights. One of the most important features of the cemetery is its view of the lake, Lake Erie to the north. Therefore, it was called Lakeview Cemetery. So something like that is not very difficult to understand. This cemetery was created with the basic outline of other rural or garden cemeteries during the rural cemetery movement. And that's something that we're really going to talk about specifically in the third module, even the second module a little bit. But one of the main points of this rural cemetery layout was the use of Victorian style art and sculpture. And again, that's something that we'll get into towards the end of the second module, beginning of the third. One of the main features that I want to point out, these cemeteries were designed to be an arboretum, which is a fancy word for botanical garden. These cemeteries were designed for recreational use. Families would have dinners and barbecues and things like that on Sundays or holidays and things like that. They weren't designed to be necessarily places of complete mourning. The intention of this design was to focus on celebration of the life, but also that they were park-like. It was a recreational setting. So it's for this reason of history, art, and culture that Lakeview Cemetery is called Cleveland's Outdoor Museum. And that's a term that's going to pop up a few times probably throughout this lecture. Now, Lakeview Cemetery, just to keep going over just a little basic history of Lakeview, is the final resting place of over 105,000 people, with about 700 per year being buried there. Now, these aren't things that you'll be quizzed on or anything like that, but they're kind of important as we go over the overview. A main point of interest that brings people to tour the cemetery is the President Garfield Memorial, which we're going to talk about throughout each of these modules. While President Garfield was buried at Lakeview in 1881, the founders and board members decided to take advantage of the opportunity of having a president buried here, and they built a monument in 1890 in his honor. So that's something that's going to become of importance, especially in the economic development, the development of cities and suburbs later on, and even the board members that came throughout to kind of help develop not only this cemetery, but many other areas of Cleveland. So the memorial would be a dedication to his memory, of course, but eventually it would set Cleveland aside as well, not only as his final resting place, but one of the major locations of the time. Also, this memorial would finally give the rural cemetery, the garden cemetery, something that it finally needed, which was a theme. It needed something to attract visitors, something for people to be able to take tours. Now individuals would utilize Lakeview Cemetery for its intended purpose of being a garden cemetery. People would be able to use the cemetery for park events. Some people, sometimes there would be a fee a fee that would be necessary to tour the memorial where Garfield and his wife were entombed. This creation of this memorial was a major turning point in Lakeview's history because it sets the cemetery apart now as basically Cleveland's outdoor museum. Now, in going back to what I referenced earlier, Cleveland's history buried here, we have to take into consideration the many other wealthy and prominent people that are buried here and that also had a lot to do with the development of Lakeview, Cleveland, and some of the other suburbs that are surrounding. We have to look at John D. Rockefeller, which we'll examine further, but Lakeview's board member one of the richest man alive, or not alive now, during his time, and above, one of the richest men of all times, buried here. Jephthah Wade, who built telegraph lines across most of the Midwest, contributed. Wade Park was the Lakeview Cemetery president at one point. He's also buried here. If we keep going and examining what historical figures are buried here, even in Cleveland, we'll look at there's Carl B. Stokes, the first black mayor of Cleveland, as well as any major city. He's buried here. The Van Sweringen brothers, who were basically contributors to the making, the development of Shaker Heights, that area. Ray Chapman, a Cleveland Indians player who died from an injury during a game. And these are just some of the many prominent people that are buried here. It also shows, and it kind of attests to Cleveland's position of prominence throughout history, and specifically during this time of 1860 to 1920. Okay. When Lakeview can be credited for doing many things during this time period, an important contribution it made was providing a spark to Cleveland's economy and our labor force. During one point, and this is something serious to consider, and a lot of these names you'll understand better during some of the other PowerPoints, but it's just important to kind of get a initial introduction to these names. But at one point, Jephthah Wade, John D. Rockefeller, Worthy Streeter, Henry Chisholm were all on Lakeview Cemetery's board. And that just shows the level of prominence in Cleveland during this time. Each of these powerhouses of the time contributed finances and land to make Lakeview a successful project. This Lakeview Cemetery partnership was not the only. It led to Standard Oil partnerships, productions of mill partnerships, architectural partnerships, city developments, suburb developments, and other partnerships throughout Cleveland. So it's just, again, a basic introduction of Lakeview, and to get us started into these modules. It'll be very helpful going forward. Now, next thing that is of importance, there is a video that's next, and it's really about about 5 minutes or less. It'll be important to watch. There is no lectures that are attached to it, no descriptions, but there are captions at the bottom of the photos, so to kind of give you a insight and just something to picture as far as what Lakeview Cemetery actually is. So you'll see a lot of the images, you'll see a lot of the sculptures, a lot of the art that went into the projects of this time. And also, by the way, even this slide, this is from Case Western Reserve, a postcard of the time. This is what Lakeview Cemetery looked like during this time. Has since developed much better, but this is just a picture of the time. So it's going to be important to watch that video, and then we'll get into the discussion questions and the other reflection assignments for the week.